Well, good evening, everybody. Just before I start, I want to say thank you to the Collingwood Historical Society for graciously inviting me to this event. I want to in particular say thanks to Kathy, Scott, and Bruce. I'm going to get your... Mackeson. I want to say Mackinac because I'm talking about the Nancy. Bruce Mackeson. So thank you very much. It's a real pleasure to be here. And as the kind introduction said, it's sort of a homecoming for me. More than I did my growing up here in Collingwood. And it's sort of interesting. I gave this something like this paper one time before. Some of you may have been there at the tall ships behind the grain elevators. I think it was about 2013 or 14. Yeah. And for me, that was a very strange experience because there I was giving a paper pretty much on the very spot that my brother and I used to fish for perch in the 80s when we were kids. So it was kind of a strange thing. But it is really nice to be here, and I really thank you all for coming out to listen to me talk about this, what I think is an interesting topic. So let me just jump right into it and get into the meat of things here. The topic, as you see there, the title is History, Tourism, and the Raising of HMS Nancy. Now, anybody, if you're familiar with this area, you do know that, just bear with me, I'm going to walk over and switch the slides every once in a while. You are aware of Nancy Island, and we've just learned that there's some people that are very aware of Nancy Island and are involved in preserving this terrific historical site. This is a little off center. I'm going to try and move this way. We'll just try and roll over. These are just a couple of images of Nancy Island, and as you see, it's just a few, really, I guess about a kilometer upriver up the Nottawasaga from the mouth. I'll just point out a couple of things before I get into what I'm talking about, just for interest's sake. If you look at the top left picture there, where the circle is sort of off-center, but it should be covering Nancy Island. You can barely make it out. The Nancy, the British supply schooner that was destroyed there, creating that island in the War of 1812, it was attacked by American warships that were sitting out just off the beach there. Okay? And so essentially what they were doing is bombing over that spit of land, so that's sort of the geography of what we're talking about here. So this is, of course, the place where that famous 1812 supply schooner HMS Nancy was destroyed in the late summer of 1814, mid-August 1814, just in the last real months, weeks of the War of 1812, actually. The Treaty of Ghent, ending that war, was signed by the British in late December 1814. Now, I don't want to talk about actually this part of the Nancy story, the War of 1812 part. Actually, what I'm interested in, and the research that I actually did for the paper in Ontario History that I published a few years back, what I'm interested in is what happened after they found the Nancy in 1925. So over a century after the Nancy was destroyed, in 1925, after a determined search, the wreck of the Nancy was found. And of course, what makes this story, one of the many things that makes this story quite interesting is the fact that the Nancy wasn't found necessarily at the bottom, dwelling at the bottom of the river underwater. The Nancy was actually found encased in soil and sand and had created its own island in a very short period of time, which says a few things. It says that the Nottawasaga River carries a lot of dirt. And if you've ever swum in the Nottawasaga River, you know that. The other thing is, the Nottawasaga River, particularly right here, is very shallow. Many years back, in my wilder days, I was water skiing with friends on the Nottawasaga River and made the disastrous mistake of trying to drop a ski and ski on one ski and promptly wiped out in the water. And to my horror, when I literally stood up, because it was so shallow where I had wiped out water skiing, it was just probably here. Okay, so it's very shallow, which does explain to a considerable degree why an island was built up over the remains of the Nancy. But the Nancy's story, its role in the War of 1812, is minor in the broad scheme of things, in the broad scheme of that war, which was actually quite an extensive war, many different theaters of operation. So the St. Lawrence region, the southern Ontario, the Niagara region, the Windsor-Detroit corridor, the upper Great Lakes, the eastern seaboard of the United States, and as far south as of course, New Orleans, with the famous Battle of New Orleans took place in early 1815 after the Treaty of Ypres was signed. So the Nancy is a small but actually a really, really important battle in that war. I'll say a little bit more about that later on. But certainly from the standpoint of the Nottawasaga region, this is one of the key claims to historical fame, I would say, the Nancy. It's one of those historical episodes that really connect this part of the world to a larger story. And in this case, obviously, the British Empire's struggle to hold on to its loyal colonies in North America, and the new American Republic's desire to shatter that hold. But again, I'm not talking about that today. I'm talking mainly about people that found the Nancy and the struggle that ensued over the remains of the Nancy. It's a really interesting story hitting, and it's familiar as something that's grown up in this part of the world. I know that Toronto 705 tension, the 416-705 tension, it's very much a battle between small town people in the north and the big city in Toronto. But there's more to it than that, obviously, and I'll try to unpack that. I started doing research on, this is actually research that I began undertaking when I was doing my master's, what seems like 1,000 years ago, at York University. I was working with historian, or taking a class with H.V. Nellis, who's a distinguished Canadian historian who at the time was really interested in talking about the uses and abuses of the past, let's call it that. A theme that Margaret Macmillan has more recently taken up. And in that course, he instructed his students to go out and find a topic that spoke to that sort of, those sorts of themes. How do people, historically, people in the past, how did they think about the past? And why did they think the way they did about the past? And what purposes did their ways of thinking about the past serve? And so I started kind of messing around, looking in the archives, and I came across a trove of information in the Ontario archives, which were then down in downtown Toronto. And I found a bunch of information that had been stowed there from the files of C.H.J. Snyder, whom I'll talk about in a bit. One of the things that jumped out at me immediately, and I couldn't believe how lucky I was in terms of this class that I was in, was that this is a perfect example of that struggle over historical meaning and different conceptions of what the purpose of history was. When I saw that there was a debate and indeed a political struggle over the remains of the Nancy, it did get to that level. The provincial government got involved, as we'll see. So it was really fascinating to me. I wrote a paper. Nella said, "Oh, you should think about sending this to Ontario History," kind of as a throwaway comment. And I eventually got it there over a decade later, well over a decade later. I turned it into a paper, but I'm still interested in this topic, and I'm still thinking about the topic and its various dimensions. So who were the people that were involved in the struggle over the remains of the Nancy? I'll talk about them in more detail in a second, but just in brief, they were, first of all, Toronto-based, let's call them cultural elites, in particular Alexander Fraser, who was the chief archivist of the province of Ontario. He led a group that included the person that founded the Nancy, F.J. Conboy. If you know anything about F.J. Conboy, he's actually, he was a very distinguished gentleman, quite wealthy, had a long sort of political career in Toronto. He actually went on to serve as mayor of Toronto during World War II, from 41 to 44, I believe. But at the time he found the Nancy, he was the director of dental services for the province of Ontario. So he was kind of an important guy. He was a big shot in the bureaucracy down in Toronto. So a group of them, and it included initially C.H.J. Snyder, who was a well-known journalist, author, marine illustrator, historian. He was connected with the Toronto Telegram newspaper. In the 30s, he published a kind of a regular column on the history of the Great Lakes, and he would illustrate those columns with his very fine artwork. That's something which I'll show you in a second. They were the Toronto group, I'll call them. The people that wanted to take the Nancy's remains, which were found here on Nancy Island, transport them to Toronto, and to place them. It was thought either in what they called the Provincial Museum, which was the ROM, or there was a plan actually that they hatched to stow the Nancy away at a new museum, CNE, the Canadian National Exhibition. And this plan got pretty far advanced, and when wind of it made its way up here, people from Collingwood actually became determined to counter that plan and hatch their own plan to keep the Nancy in situ, preferably. They weren't sure exactly what to do with it at first, but fairly quickly they decided it made a lot of sense, and indeed there were some of the earliest plans that it should just be exhumed and placed on the island in a barn or some kind of facility, housing placed over top of it. And that quickly became the plan for the Collingwood people to do that. And so those were the groups involved. That group just incidentally involved Mayor J. Robbins Arthur, and David Williams, who was involved with the Huron Institute, which was housed in the old Carnegie Library here in Collingwood. And he was also a co-editor of what was at the time called the Collingwood Bulletin. It wasn't the Enterprise Bulletin, which it would later become. There were other people as well, but those are the main players. Okay. So I want to talk about these people, and I looked at basically correspondence between them and whatever other information I could find. Lots and lots of newspaper coverage of the location. When they found the Nancy, it sparked all sorts of interest across the board as far as Toronto and beyond. And so there's lots of that information available about the finding of the Nancy. So I used that information and tried to put together the story of what happened after it was found and why it was that the Nottawasaga people, I call them in my article, people from this area, why it was that they won at the end of the day. Okay? I'll say more about that in a bit. So I was looking at this debate, as I said, to think about how these people thought about history and why they thought about history the way that they did. One of the things that struck me was that on both sides of the debate there's very little argument over what the Nancy meant. They were pretty sure they knew what it meant. and they essentially espoused a very long-standing interpretation of the meaning of the Nancy and indeed the War of 1812, which of course was that the War of 1812 was Canada's, and these sorts of terms were used to describe Canada's first baptism in blood. It was a crucible in which all of the various contending groups in Canada, the British, the French, First Nations people were kind of forged into one. And so it was the story of Canada's emergence as a unified nation. It fit very nicely into the narrative, sort of an old-fashioned narrative of Canadian history from Canada going from colony to nation. And that was shared, again, Alexander Fraser, he actually did yeoman's work in building up that narrative. He was a historian himself. David Williams, on the other side, same thing. He pretty much understood it the same way. It was the story of a British nation emerging in North America. It was a story of British-Canadian nationalism. I'll say more about that in a second. So that was real. There was no, when I looked at what they were saying about it, that they were all agreed. It was there was a meeting that, yep, we can agree on that. The motion moved. What they didn't agree on, though, was that what we should do with this artifact, what its present uses ought to be. So what purpose did this remnant from the past that suddenly showed up, what purpose did it serve the people of Ontario and indeed the people of Canada? And on that point, there was pretty sharp disagreement. So what I'm going to do is I want to explore I want to look at that idea of British-Canadian nationalism and what it meant to these people first. Next, what I want to do is to look at their competing agendas. But first, before I do that, I want to say a little bit. Just for those of you out there, I know that some of you are probably very familiar with the story of the Nancy and the War of 1812, but for those of you out there that are not, I'm going to give some background, and then I'll bring it back up to the present. Okay? So the Nancy, what was the Nancy, first of all? Well, it was a schooner, which is a two-masted ship. If you're from Collingwood and you know anything about Collingwood's history, you would see lots of schooners out in the harbor in Collingwood. Very common scene in the 19th century, especially in the age of wind and sail, as they call it. It was built in 1789 by Forsyth, Richardson and Co., a fur trading company. It was later by about and it was built at Detroit, actually. It was later sold to the Northwest Company. The Northwest Company, you may or not be familiar with it. It was an extremely important fur trading company based out of Montreal. Very intrepid explorers. Alexander Mackenzie, for instance, worked with the Northwest Company, and he was the first to cross the continent, as they say. But it was, of course, gobbled up by an entity that we are no doubt quite familiar with, the Hudson's Bay Company in 1820. And so the Nancy was essentially a fur trading vessel. And so what it did is it operated on Lake Erie, Huron, and Michigan, shuttling fur traders, personnel involved in the fur trade, shuttling furs, obviously, and supplies from fort to fort, and other types of merchandise. So that's what it was doing at the outbreak of war in June 1814. And it was operating just near Detroit at that time. And immediately the British commandeered it into service as a vessel, transport vessel in the war effort. It was present at the capture of Detroit early on in the war. so it had seen some quick action. If you want to, Barry Goff's book on the Nancy, if you're interested in the story, details these events quite nicely. What the Nancy started doing was, it's kind of its most important role throughout the war, was to shuttle supplies to Mackinac Island. And early in the war, General Isaac Brock had done something quite ingenious. Mackinac Island is cut off at the top left there. So it's right at the very, if you can see this, the borderline that goes through Lake Huron, it sort of points at the top to where Mackinac Island. The Nottawasaga is, see where it says upper? It's just due north of the second peak. In any case, the Nancy's main job early on in the war, when it was down in the Lake St. Clair region in Lake Huron, was to move supply goods up to Mackinac. It was essential to do that because the Mackinac, while far flung way up there, it's still, it's still very north to us now, certainly in southern Ontario. So you can imagine how out of the way it was then. But it was a critical sort of axis of the fur trade, which was very important on both sides, the British and the American sides, during the War of 1812. So supplying that fort was critical. And as I said, Isaac Brock had ordered a small force to take it early on in the war, and the British were determined at all costs to hold on to it because of its strategic importance and because it did command such a wide territory. And it was so critically important to that, really the main industry during that period, the fur trade in the British colonies. So that's what the Nancy was doing. In 1813, Oliver Hazard Perry, famously the American admiral, captured Lake Erie from the British. And that was a decisive moment in the war because up to that point, in fact, the British had been largely successful and the Americans had been doing quite poorly. The capture of Detroit is kind of the classic example of that. But there were other failures as well. So taking Lake Erie from the British was enormously important. Obviously, very strategically placed, gave the Americans ready access to southern Ontario, and they made quick use of that. And before you know it, they've invaded all the way up to what's now London, the Battle of the Thames, and make it as far as Stony Creek before they're repulsed by the British in a surprise attack. But the point with regards to the Nancy is that that changed the dynamic of the naval war for the British. And so the British really had to defend against the aggressive American naval forces. The Nancy moved into Lake Huron and was briefly stowed away at what's now Sault Ste. Marie. The Americans made some attempt to get Mackinac back. That failed, but American ships nonetheless prowled around Lake Huron and Georgian Bay off to the east there. And in the meantime, the Nancy was involved in transporting goods between a new supply route that the British had set up. The idea was that it was supposed to be far enough away from the front that it was safe from American attack. And that, of course, was the route that went from Toronto up the Holland River to Cook's Bay, to Lake Simcoe, across the 9-mile portage, eventually to Willow Creek, and eventually the Nottawasaga River. And that took, so supplies made that, and in fact they probably started at Montreal for many of them, some of them coming from Toronto as well. Of course, Toronto, York as it was called, was captured and burnt by Zebulon Pike Pikes Peak fame, if you've ever been to Colorado. He died at that battle, I believe. In any case, that new supply line was well behind enemy territory, or the enemy reach, I should say. And the Nancy was the sort of maritime end of it. So those goods made it all the way to what we call sometimes now Schooner Town. Suffice it to say it was a depot at the mouth of the Nottawasaga. There were some petty reinforcements there, and the Nancy ran goods back and forth. That's what its job was, to keep Mackinac up and running, to keep those soldiers defending that fort fed and supplied with their other necessities. Of course, when those ships started prowling around, the Nancy had to be very careful, and it received word eventually that the situation was perilous and that it ought to take cover. And that's when its commander, Miller Worsley, docked it essentially up the river in Nottawasaga. And indeed, the American warships, the Tigress and the Scorpion, located it. They saw, the story is that they saw the Nancy's spars sort of sticking out above the trees, and knew they'd found it. And opened up a bombardment. Worsley, being cautious, was not keen on leaving anything for the Americans to take, let alone take an entire ship and put it into service for the Americans. So he set it on fire. And essentially what happened is the Nancy burned to the water line, the hull sank to the bottom of the Nottawasaga, and the rest of the story I've told you. So let's bring it up to, I'm getting ahead of my notes here, which I have a very bad habit of doing. Let's take it up to the present and the discovery of the Nancy, and what the people that became, or that were so interested in it at that time, thought about the Nancy in the War of 1812 and its meaning, its historical significance. So as I mentioned, it was a summer cottager, F.J. Conboy. He had a cottage in Wasaga Beach, which at that time was very small. There were very few permanent families living there. It didn't have a very large permanent population. It was mostly cottagers. It was hard to get to, I think, was the main problem with Wasaga Beach at that time. There were roads, obviously, but we're talking about in the mid-1920s, still very much at the front end of the first phase of automobility. So it's kind of difficult to get there. It's not a surprise that you'll find wealthy people that have the means to have a cottage there, or to spend some leisure time at a sort of a fancy hotel. But it does, of course, begin to become a place where more ordinary people, working class people, begin to set up cottages as well. Certainly that's the post-World War II story of Wasaga Beach, but there's evidence of that definitely before World War II. But Conboy is one of those well-to-do city folk that have a cottage up in Wasaga Beach. He's fascinated with the War of 1812. He's read books by C.H.J. Snyder, in particular his book, The 1812ers, which is sort of a swashbuckling account of the naval campaigns on the Great Lakes. And Conboy knows that the Nancy was destroyed in the vicinity of where his cottage was. And so he spends time, especially in 1924, walking around trying to find the Nancy. He finds things like a cannonball lodged in the riverbank, and that sort of thing. But he's, in fact, he gets pretty systematic about it. A local MPP, by the last name Curry, familiar name in and around this area, he and Curry map out a grid basically and say, we're going to check this spot, and they keep track of where they've been, that sort of thing. In 1925, He using an iron bar, walking around, and he plunges it into the ground, and he hears what Snyder describes as the answering ring of iron. He hit something that might have been a rock, it could have been something else. And he starts digging and finds that it was something else that was actually the Nancy. Now, it must be said that Snyder, in his book 1812ers, which was published, I think, in 1911, if memory serves me, Snyder hadn't mentioned that early that Nancy's whereabouts actually had been well known to people in the area, trappers, fishermen, and eventually cottagers. He states in that book that people would actually, moor their small craft to the timbers of the Nancy, which were sticking out. He also makes the claim of the sort of the bank of the island. He makes the claim also that in that book that the topographical changes have buried it and it got lost to memory. Snyder, in his own words, actually did employ a good deal of fancy, let's call it, in his descriptions. But that one seems kind of interesting to me because of the date, 1911. So there probably was some local knowledge about its whereabouts. And definitely that part, the Nottawasaga, as I've been describing it, was very malleable. The topography did change. It was mostly sand, and sand moves around. Okay, so I just have to watch time. Is that clock correct there? It's 1:45? Yes? Okay. Move it along. So how did these people think about, why did they kind of give the Nancy so much importance? What was it about the Nancy? Well, as I said at the outset, it really spoke to the way that people thought about the War of 1812 at that time as a British Canadian moment in terms of the building of a British Canadian nation. It's singularly important for people in the interwar period, so between World War I and World War II. That identity was very strong. And even within my lifetime, I remember sort of the vestiges of that kind of identity. Whether it was, playing hockey here at the Eddie Bush Memorial Arena and seeing the portrait of the Queen at the end of the arena, which was very typical of just about everywhere I played hockey. My parents definitely can attest to the fact that the British Empire was still very alive as an entity that had meaning for them. So for these people in the interwar period, it was extremely important. And certainly in Ontario, in English-speaking Ontario, the British connection, as they called it, was supremely important. And so this was a story of Canada's development and growth and maturity as a British nation. The War of 1812 was sort of the first major step towards that. It sort of vouchsafed and forecasted what Canada was to become. And when you think about the 1920s, of course, it's coming after World War I. World War I, for many of the historical commentators at the time, was connected to this narrative that went back as far as 1812, and indeed as far as the 7 Years' War, and beyond even. This story of the development of a British nation in North America. Canada's service and sacrifice during World War I, many people interpreted that as Canada's defensive empire. There is evidence of it, that identity breaking down, definitely, by World War I and certainly beyond. There's also the nagging problem of the fact that, in fact, during World War I, Canada was brutally divided along linguistic lines. But for English Canadians, World War I was part of that narrative. So it was even that much more meaningful when an artifact of the War of 1812, that kind of first step towards Canada becoming a British nation worthy of the name. So that's the way that it was often conceived. and as I suggested, on both sides of this debate. There was another element, and this is an element that I actually, if you read my article, I don't really touch on this, but it is a feature of this kind of narrative of the British nation, and it's what I call providential history. There's a strong notion that that this was part of a celestial master plan for the British Empire. Okay, in 1812 the victory was assured, and that Canadians therefore were carrying out that kind of logic in commemorating the success of the war and the Nancy's part of it. So that's a part of that too. And we're talking about a very religious society in pre-World War II, in the pre-World War II period. That meant a lot to people. Convoy himself was an example of that. And I'll just show you sort of a curious picture that hopefully illustrates the point a little. I forgot to mention this. This is if you go to Nancy Island right now, there's a cairn on Nancy Island with a plaque on it. And the Monuments Board, that's probably had announced in May of 1925, before Convoy made his discovery, that they were going to honor Nancy with that cairn. By August, after the Nancy was discovered, just a few weeks after it, the cairn was put in place. This is from the Collingwood Bulletin from mid-August 1925. So it couldn't have been more fortuitously timed. And at that unveiling in August, there were some speeches that were given where all of this talk about the empire and so on was given vent. That is, I've just got a couple of illustrations I'll show you quickly. This is, I mentioned that C.H.J. Snyder was an artist as well as a historian and a columnist in the Telegram. This is his rendering of the Nancy. As you can see, he's a very skilled artist. This is his rendering of the Tigress and the Scorpion, the ships that bombarded the Nancy. I'm just going to skip ahead to this. I'm going to ask you, hopefully, you can't read that caption. This is F.J. Convoy. This is from the Collingwood Bulletin in August 1925, at the end of August. What is he standing in front of there? And what is he holding in his hand? His hands. I find that's a very interesting picture. Anybody have any idea? Yes, they are collection plates. So Convoy, and the kicker here is the collection plates made from timbers taken from the Nancy.
Interesting.
So he really felt a sense of entitlement, I would say, to that artifact. But in Convoy's defense in this time period, and he was actually he was really involved in his church in Toronto. If you're from Toronto, you may have the west end of Toronto, you may know of Westmoreland United. He was an elder there, and he was a very active person in public life, but that was the thing that he liked to do the most, was to serve that church. He had these collection plates turned out from timber from the Nancy, and he gave them, I think, to the Presbyterian. It says the community church in Wasaga Beach. I think that's the Presbyterian church in Wasaga. Even though he's the United Church, it was actually an amalgam of the Presbyterians and the Methodists, so I think there might be a connection there. But in any case, I found that interesting. It's interesting in this context, I would say, of the notion of 1812 as sort of a providential war. The idea that God was on our side, right, is a very familiar phrase. And there is that connection there. I think sometimes it's not highlighted, but it was very important for people during this time period, is my point. I'm going to skip over that just for the sake of time. I'll just quickly tell you what it is. Actually, I'll get to it in a second. I'll leave it there and so that's the sort of the way that both sides are thinking about this history, about the Nancy, its importance. Okay? Now, the next question is, though, well, who gets to keep the Nancy? And what purposes should the Nancy serve? The burnt-out hull that I showed you the picture at the start on the title page, not much there, really, right? Just a few timbers. But they were really interested in retaining it. And why were they? Well, I'll start with the Toronto people. I mentioned that Alexander Fraser, was the archivist for the province of Ontario. When Convoy and his colleagues contacted the government after finding the Nancy, they quickly put Convoy and his colleagues in touch with Alexander Fraser. And Fraser was very quickly dispatched to Wasaga Beach to survey the scene, check out what was there and what needed to be done. Interestingly, he brought, there's reports that a film crew came with him or was on scene when he was there. And I have noticed that if you go on YouTube, there's a brief film of the removal of the Nancy on YouTube. It's kind of interesting to check out. I have a feeling that is that film that I'm talking about. I don't know for sure. But Fraser represented what I've kind of termed the effort at cultural modernity. So we see during this period, during the industrial period, cities emerging as cultural hubs. Right? That's where all of the important stuff was housed and located. The British Museum in London, right, is a classic example. And they went around the world, obviously, grabbing stuff from all over the place and throwing it in that museum because London was so important culturally. That's a process of modernity. Historians have spent a lot of time talking about. I think that's what's going on with the Toronto people here. The museum, Fraser as the archivist, and the people involved with the CNE that he starts deal making with, the province itself, and representatives with the government of Howard Ferguson. They're all of the mind that Toronto is the best place for this. It's so important an artifact that it shouldn't be left out in the boondocks. It needs to be somewhere where the most people can see it and learn from it is the rationale. But I think there's another rationale there that has to do with that the assumption on the part of urban cultural elites that they're entitled to that material heritage. And of course, when that plan is announced, the Treasurer of Ontario, William Price, sort of goes before the press and says, yes, the province is going to exhume the Nancy's remains and we're going to throw it on a train and we're going to take it to Toronto. People up here set their hair on fire and ran around screaming because how dare the Toronto people presume to do that. In my article I mentioned that there's a pastor who is the pastor of St. Mary's Church and a church in Wasaga Beach who wrote an outraged letter to the Price, I believe, saying, you can't do this. My parishioners are saying that it's a violation of their rights and so on. But it's David Williams, this guy, the secretary of the Huron Institute, who really, they're afraid of him right off the start, actually. The Toronto people are mindful of him right from the start. They say there's a guy in Collingwood who's quite likely going to give us a hard time about this Toronto plan. And they guessed correctly because he did. This is just the annual report of the Huron Institute submitted in May 1925 to the province, so before the Nancy was located. You can't read the top paragraph, but I'll just paraphrase it. It says, please don't cut off our funding. We need the funding because material heritage is important for tourism, and this place is becoming more and more attractive to tourists. So it would be bad timing to do that. That's basically what he's saying, even before the Nancy is uncovered. In the pages of the bulletin, the Collingwood Bulletin, he elaborates on that idea. Yes, he agrees that this is a tremendous national artifact. But he also says that it has an enormous importance locally as an attraction. And more people are driving here in cars. And they want to come here and see something besides trees. Right? Kind of idea. And so there's the argument on the other side that tourism, motor tourism, a new thing, is of the uppermost importance. I'm just totally at the end of my notes. I'll just wing my way through this here. Okay, so they win. And they win for, I'll just describe a couple of reasons. We're running out of time, I realize. They win because, first of all, they get organized. So Williams joins forces with J. Robbins Arthur, the mayor. C.H.J. Snyder eventually jumps on board with that group. They form a Nancy committee dedicated to getting the province to change course. And they begin, essentially, in a nutshell, a lobbying effort to put pressure on the government to leave it where it is and to spend some money and build an enclosure here in Nottawasaga, and that's the right thing to do. I think so that pressure is absolutely critical. They keep up the pressure. And then in very short order, something interesting happens politically. Price, the treasurer, the guy that's in charge of any kind of financial outlay to salvage the wreck, he's getting worried about the politics of the whole thing. Why? Well, the provincial government at the time, take a wild guess what the party was. It was a conservative government, and led by Howard Ferguson. They had come to power after Barry's E.C. Drury and his Farmers' Party had basically crumbled in 1923. And they are on so they've been in power since 23. They're looking at another election. And what was the big issue of that day? 1925. Does anybody want to hazard a guess? 1925-26. It was almost a referendum, this provincial election on this issue. What couldn't you do?
Drink.
Drink in the 1920s. It was a very contentious issue. The Scott Act, 50% of the population hated it. I don't know if that's the actual proportion, but it's very, very divisive. It was rumored that Ferguson's government, which had been in power for a while and was seemingly doing all right, was going to get rid of prohibition in Ontario, or at least do something. And what it did do is actually it brought in the LCBO after it was reelected. But it was such a touchy issue, and touchy issues mean that any movement of votes one way or the other could be disaster. And there's lots of examples of that politically in history. And so Fraser is writing to Price saying, we need this, we need that, and Price starts writing back to him saying, cool your jets. And eventually he says, we're probably not going to do this. And that gives the opening for the Nottawasaga people to move in and say, well, let's keep it here, and let's have some government money to build an enclosure on the island. And that's precisely what happens. By 1927, the decision is made that Nancy will stay. And this is a postcard of the raising of the Nancy out of its grave on Nancy Island. I think I have another postcard here of that homely shed that the government, that this is your tax dollars in action right there. Okay? It's basically less than a Quonset hut, really. It's just the cheapest possible housing. In my article, I talk about the Meaford paper is scoffing at that as a museum, saying how ridiculously unattractive it is. But that remained basically where the Nancy was housed for very many years. It's not until I keep going over here, I'm a teacher, and that's where I usually put the slides. until the 1960s, in the early 1960s, there's a real effort on the part of the provincial government at using local heritage as a development strategy and providing funds for that. I think it's under Robarts that happens. And by 1968-69, the Nancy's current, still really modern-looking, attractive buildings are put in place. The Cranston Theatre, I think that's a mid-'80s vintage or early '80s vintage building. The Friends of the Nancy will correct me on that. But this is, of course, what you see and what, as a young person, I saw every time I went to the beach and was mildly curious about what was in there. And that's, of course, where you go and watch the film about the Nancy's heroic adventures. I think I'm going to, just for the sake of time, I'm going to just say a few things about this, and I'll leave it. We'll end there. One of the things that I do in that article is I leave off saying something about the War of 1812, the way we think about it now. Now that that British, Canadian nationalism, imperialism narrative has gone away, it's really not that meaningful for people in the post-World War II period. Certainly after 1982. And definitely Canada has changed enormously in those decades. So this narrative is really not a very strong one. And I would argue not a very effective one at describing really what the War of 1812 is about. That's easy for me to say. But there's still a lot of work that needs to be done on the War of 1812 and putting it kind of in a different historical context that has meaning for us now. There are noble efforts at that. George Shepard's work and other books on the War of 1812 have looked at it from a broader perspective, have put it in, used new concepts to think about the War of 1812. One that I like is the American historian Alan Taylor's The Civil War of 1812, a title that should sound very strange to you when you hear it. Taylor is an American, and of course the Americans have something to say about this. After all, they were the other side in this battle, or in this war. And Taylor's thesis is kind of an interesting one. I know it's contentious. A lot of people aren't convinced by it. But Taylor essentially wants to see the War of 18, and this is the way actually that I have always taught it, as sort of a continuation of the struggle for North America that really started in the late 17th century, through the 18th century, into the early 19th century. He sees it sort of as a culmination of the 7 Years' War, in particular, the American War of Independence, and this is just sort of the last breath of that struggle. That's a different way of thinking about it than thinking about it as the building of the Canadian nation, or a British Canadian nation. And in fact, he goes to at some length in this book in describing how it was more of a sort of a locally contained war of border skirmishes and battles amongst people who weren't actually all that different from one another. There were late loyalists in Ontario who weren't very loyal at all, or at least had no real sense of attachment to the empire. There were the Federalists. He talks about the Federalist Party in the United States in contrast to the Republicans who eventually waged war on the British colonies. The Federalists were very hierarchical-minded. They were somewhat sympathetic to the British, if you could say that about the post-revolutionary United States. There was the issue of Irish immigrants, Protestant Irish, Catholic Irish, and their very complex identities. There were French Canadians. There were Aboriginal peoples, some of whom actually were allied with the Americans, most of whom were allied with the British, but whose alliances were really dependent on the capacity of the British to provide them with supplies and annual gifts and so on. A very transactional relationship that had nothing really to do about building an identity. So it's a very complex, or at least a fine-grained interpretation of the War of 1812 that I think is a fruitful way of thinking about it. How then do we take that new way of thinking about it and apply it to the way we look at material culture and the material artifacts of our history? I think that's the challenge. I don't pretend to have the answers to that. But I think that if we want to keep history alive for future generations, if we want young people now to take an interest in our material heritage and pass it on, we've got to find ways of making it relevant to them and describing a history that is meaningful to them, rather than simply kind of defaulting back to the old way of thinking about it, the colony to nation narrative, which is still very prevalent. And I think I'll leave it at that. So thank you very much. I really appreciated your
I could call a Mary Lou Dunn paper speaker, and then I'll be back.
That was most enlightening.